Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ina and today I have here two cattleyas that I have shown you on my previous unboxing. I will let the video linked down below and also we're here on the screen. So this video will be a little bit different as you can see. You were not probably watching my face as I usually showed you because my microphone simply stopped working and I had to do this amazing voiceover because I didn't want to lose the video. So I want to tell you a little bit more why I decided to do this video. I have these two cattleyas. They need to be reported immediately. One of them is my ROC Ashbourne Ruby Red Ribbon. And the other one is ROC Bangkok Sunlight. One of them is potted in like some sort of cocoa coir, cocoa peat on this basket. And the other one is potted, I think it's like bark or charcoal, I'm not sure. That's the one that I'm showing you right now. So this is full of charcoal and I have these type of basket where the roots are all around it. The cocoa peat is extremely hard. That's why I want to show you today, because if you are not really careful, you can lose all of the roots of your plant. So the only way for you to remove this medium is to pre-soak it before you repot it. So that's what I've decided to do here. I had to soak these orchids for half an hour before I repotted. That's what you should do as well. If you find something like these orchids in these pots, you have to soak it before you repot, at least for half an hour. The cocoa peat and also the bark pieces, they will detach from the root system, or at least in the case of the cocoa peat, it will become soft or a little bit softer. So you find it easier to remove it and to repot these plants. So another thing that is very important before you repot your cattleyas, especially if you're beginners, is to check for new growths. As you can see on these my two cattleyas, there are some new growths sprouting for the pot. So that's why I decided to repot them now, because I know that even if I lose all the roots inside these pots, these cattleyas will be able to bounce back because the newer growths will sprout new roots. That's very important when you are repotting your cattleyas. So soak it, check for the newer growths first of all, and then you can repot your plant. I'm not going to say that's going to be the easiest process, because you can see one has all of the roots attached to the pot on the basket and the other one has a very, very hard medium. But that's what I want to tell you before we repot this video. Let me know if you have experienced that before, if you have bought any plant like that before. And let's start repotting these plants. So I have here my tray and I have my first plant, that's my ruby red ribbon. And I will start showing you what to do first. You squeeze the pot. You're gonna see that's very easy removable in this case, because it became like a solid block and I soaked it before. So there is no medium inside the basket, as you can see. And I have here my cattleya. So the first thing that I will start doing here is I will start carefully trying to remove all this cocoa peat. You have to be really careful with the root system, but cattleyas they are pretty sensitive, so they tend to lose most of their roots after repotting. So what I'm gonna do here, I will start with the back bulbs first. So the back of the orchid, that's what I'm doing here. Remove all the medium from the back of the orchid because these are not the newest growths. So these roots are the older ones. And I have to be very, very careful with the front of the orchid because that's where the newer growth is at the moment, and it just pushed the new roots. That's the growth that I'm holding at the moment. That's the newest growth. So as you can see, I'm removing chunks of cocoa peat. That's how it's coming, and it's a little bit harder towards the middle of the orchid because I have so many roots in there, and the cocoa peat is pretty attached to these roots. Although I'm trying to be very, very careful here, I'm definitely losing some of the roots. So just inspect your orchids and try to remove the out layers first, and always look for the older growths. Because if you lose these roots, they will die eventually, while the newer growths, they produce a new root system and they can still push through new roots, but the whole orchid depends on these roots to survive. So that's what I would advise you in this case. Although, as you can see, I soaked the orchid, but it is still a little bit hard to remove all of this medium from the plant. I'm being extremely careful here, but there are so many chunks that are attached to the root system. It makes my work a little bit more difficult, but I expected that. I had 2 dendrobiums potted on this medium before, and when I had no experience and I didn't soak it, I lost all the root system of my orchid, so it wasn't a big issue for them. But cattleyas, their root system is a little bit more sensitive, I would say. But this one is a big plant, so I'm sure it will bounce back soon as well. So you should try to carefully remove all of this cocoa peat. And just to remind you, it's a little bit easier here because I soaked this orchid before I start filming. So that's really, really important. I've removed from this point most of the chunk bits of the cocoa peat, as you can see. So I still have lots of medium towards the center of the orchid, like there is a bowl of roots. So this part is the harder part to get to and to remove the medium in the best way possible. So the next step is I'm going to the sink and I'm going to rinse the root system to help to remove the rest of this medium, and I will come back here to show you how it is. So I have rinsed my root system. I can see it much clearer now. What I'm doing here is just checking the root system, checking which roots are alive and which roots are dead. I can see clearly that some of them are losing development, is pretty mushy, and I can see there is no substance in there, so the root is completely dead in this case. There are other dead roots around the orchid, towards the middle and towards the back bulbs. And I have new roots that I mentioned before. These are towards the newer growths. I have here my pair of pruners, and I'm going to start cutting all the dead roots. It's very important that you cut the dead roots because you don't want it to spoil the medium that your orchid will be in. So inspect the root system and check for dead roots, and then you can cut them. With the process of removing the cocoa peat, I definitely broke some of the roots. I knew it would happen. In this case, my cattleya is a big cattleya, so I'm sure it will bounce back soon. As you can see, I don't have many roots left here, but I'm not very concerned because I can see we have new growths. So I will rinse this root system once more just to make sure everything's cleaned, and I will be back to pot this orchid finally. I'm going to use some hydrogen peroxide 3% to spray the root system. I have found snails on these roots before when I was soaking the orchid. So it's really, really important that you spray hydrogen peroxide on the roots of your newer orchids, because they can definitely have some pests and pathogens in the root system, and hydrogen peroxide will kill all of its eggs and pathogens, and not all of the pathogens, sorry, some of them that you can find on the root system. The only time that I don't spray the root system of my newer orchids with hydrogen peroxide is when I buy Phalaenopsis from supermarkets, because I have never found any snails on these plants, but I have already found snails on Phalaenopsis from some nurseries. So it's your call, but most of the orchids, I would suggest you to spray hydrogen peroxide 3%. So let's start. You can spray it deliberately all around the root system to make sure you don't have any snails, eggs hidden in between, or anything that you can't see properly. So you just spray everything, and you start hearing a fizz, some sort of sound. That means that the hydrogen peroxide is working on the root system. So when you finish spraying it, you can let it fizz for a few minutes. I have here my pot. It's a 12 centimeters pot. I drew some holes on it with my soldering machine. I live in a pretty cold place, so cattleyas need lots of air around their root system, and my environment is pretty humid and cold. I always use sphagnum moss and bark in all of my potting mixes, most of my potting mixes, sorry. In this case, I will place some moss on the bottom and some layers of bark and moss, but I live in a cold place, as I mentioned before, so I will use more bark than moss, because bark is pretty airy and it helps my cattleyas to grow. And if I place a lot of sphagnum moss, the medium won't dry very fast, and I can have some root rot and other issues. And I noticed my cattleyas, they grow nicely when I have mostly bark in my pot. So I use a different approach with other type of orchids, such as oncidiums. But for my cattleyas and Phalaenopsis, I prefer to have more bark in my potting than moss. So I will grab my moss now. I use New Zealand sphagnum moss. I will link the place where I buy it down below if you are interested, if you live in the UK. But I will tell you that the median depends on where you live in the globe. There are places where are pretty hot, like tropical countries and Mediterranean countries. These places you can definitely use more moss maybe, but where I live is pretty cool. So as you can see, I'm placing the moss here on the bottom, and I'm gonna use a lot of bark. I have some orchiata bark that I bought recently. This cattleya has many new eyes across the plant, so I'm gonna place it in the middle of the pot because I don't know where the newer growths will sprout. When you have only one direction of growth, usually I place the older growths towards the border of the pot, but in the edge of the pot. But in this case, the plant has many directions of growth, so I'm placing it in the middle of the pot, and I keep filling my pot with bark and moss, and using more bark than I use moss. Something that I do with most of my repotting is placing some slow release fertilizer in the pot as well with my bark and sphagnum moss. So one of the last layers that I was placing of moss, I just sprinkle some slow release fertilizer beads just to keep the orchids, to help the orchids to grow healthily. But more than that, as you can see, I finished potting up my big cattleya. So I have here the second one. The difference here is that you can see it's potted in a basket and lots of roots are basically attached to the pot, and that it's potted in charcoal. I'm sure it's charcoal, and that it's pretty hard to remove it from the pot. It's pretty attached to the pot. I can't remove it I'm trying to remove some of the orchids that are attached to it, but the orchid's not coming. Although I have soaked it before, it was a few hours ago. So I'm trying to remove some of the pieces on the top, but the orchid's not coming out. This one is harder than I thought. I was really imagining that it would be much difficult to unpot and to repot the other one. But this one is potted in a horrendous type of pot and medium probably is really, really old. So the orchid's not coming out of the pot, even removing all the top bits of charcoal and cutting some of the roots as you saw before. So yeah, it's not coming out. What I'm trying to do here, I'm squeezing the pot, trying to squeeze it to check if the orchid will come out or not. So as you can see, it's not being possible to remove this orchid. So I'm gonna get my pair of scissors and I will simply cut all of these plastic pot. Most of the cases, I prefer to lose the roots than cutting the plastic pot because plastic doesn't degrade in nature, or it takes like so long to degrade and polluted everything, and you can reuse your pot. This case, I will not reuse this black pot. So I decided to cut it to remove my orchid, but that's the last thing that you should do. I don't advise you doing it. If you can reuse your pot with your orchids or other houseplants. So as you can see, I'm gonna keep basically cutting all of this basket that my orchid is in, trying to remove it. It was pretty attached to the plastic and it was not coming out. I wasn't expecting it. As I mentioned before, I thought the other one would be much harder to remove from this pot, but this one is extremely difficult. I can see the root system inside is almost all dead. The medium is very old, it's pretty attached to everything. So be careful when you do it. If you have to remove any of these plastic baskets, you have to be very careful because you can cut yourself with it. Plastic, especially these hardened up plastics, they can hurt you and a few pieces can fly around, so be really careful. So as you can see, I have my orchids almost free, but let's keep cutting and cutting this horrible pot. So my orchids is almost free, but I don't have only the plastic pot, the plastic basket. I have as well another basket, a seedling basket in the middle of the orchid, a very old one that I'm cutting as well. I don't understand why they didn't remove it. They just place one on top of the other one. It's not only the plug that is in there, the plastic seedling pot is still there. So it was basically two plastic pots, one on the top of the other one, and this one is pretty difficult to remove as well. What I can see here is the whole root system. Everything is dead on this orchid. It's terrifying. It's horrible. I wasn't expecting that. I was imagining that it would be very similar to other type of repotting that I've done before, but it's not. Look at the basket coming from the middle of the orchid. I had to cut that as well. Let's remove everything that I can see here. It's pretty hard to cut these baskets and having to remove all the medium as well on top of it. But all the orchids are dead, so it's okay. I'm not being very gentle here, but I can see the medium is very old. It's looking, it's horrible. I had mold in the middle of the bowl there. This one is like much worse than the other one. It's being more difficult to remove. The situation of the root system is not good either, so I definitely didn't expect that. It's okay. These orchids had two sections. As you can see, I have a small section here that I'm removing all the dead roots. Most of them are dead, as I said 1,000 times. And I will do the same thing that I've done with the last orchid. I will keep cutting all the dead roots that I can see on this orchid. I remove everything from it. I will speed up the process so you don't need to check and see me cutting all the dead roots on this orchid. So I'm back. I have here two divisions, a smaller one and a bigger one, and I will put them together. So as you can see, I didn't save much of the root system. Everything was dead. I just left some roots because I'm scared that it won't have much energy to survive. But I have a newer growth coming from the smaller division, and I have a newer growth coming from the bigger division. And I hope this newer growth here, I'm sure it will start pushing through a whole new root system soon. So is it okay that I cut most of the roots? In this case, I know that the newer growth will produce newer roots soon. So what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna pot this orchid as I've potted the other one. I will use bark and moss. The first layer, I will create a first layer of moss, and then the process will be the same. I won't film it, so you don't have to see me doing everything again. I will show you my 2 orchids when they are done and potted. A few things before I conclude this video. I have here my 2 cattleyas completely potted. I have already watered them both. After I repot my orchids, I offer them some water. I will place them near my window here. The window behind where I'm filming, it's a southern or eastern exposure window, so the light is pretty high in there, and I don't have space on my shelving for these plants. Cattleyas are highlight plants, so growing them in London, you need to have a very good window with highlight exposure or some artificial lighting. Otherwise, they won't grow well. They need highlight to grow well. So I will have to place them, I think, on my windowsill for now because I don't have space on my shelving. A few thoughts, as I mentioned before, I didn't expect to be so hard to remove the charcoal on the second orchid. Most of the root system were dead in there. Hopefully the newer growth will push through new roots soon, and I'll have a completely healthier and happier orchid in a fresher medium. The first orchid, I will have to unpot it in a month or so because I had roots in there, but I think most of these roots won't survive. So in this case, it's better if I unpot this orchid in a month, so at least I can cut all of the dead roots inside the pot, and hopefully it will push through a new root system as well in no time, and the dead roots won't spoil the medium. So that's what I'm gonna do next. Yeah, so that was everything that I wanna tell you today. I'm sorry for this different type of video, but that was the only way that I could save this video and show you how I repotted the plant to cocoa peat sort type of medium. Yeah, that was everything that I had to tell you today. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button, leave a comment down below, and if you can, and if you'd like, subscribe to my channel. It helps me a lot to make this community grow, and also it's really nice to have people in here leaving comments, giving me some tips, exchanging information about plants. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to have you here. I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.